All right, welcome to Lament of Hope blog and podcast. I'm your host, Danielle Richardson, and it's exciting for me today, coming up on the 100th episode to be published. In fact, by the time this goes out, it will be published, and it's just been so fascinating to talk to so many different types of people with different interests and careers. And today I'm talking to Lucy Adlington, who's an author, but she has a deep love for historical costume and historical outfits. And she is a collector of vintage costumes, as well as writes several novels and books that focus on historical outfits and their relevance to the time period. And I was actually just talking to Lucy before this because this is something that, I'm totally coming at blind and new to. Um, and I came across one of her recent books that she wrote about women in Auschwitz who actually sewed to survive. I believe the book is called The Dressmakers of Auschwitz. Um, Lucy, before we start and dive into the book and all of that, I want to ask, what gave you an interest in what people wear in history? Like, how did that, when you were a child, was that just something you were really interested in, or did that grow when you went to school? I mean, how did you grow to find that love that you wanted to pursue it as a career?
A good question. And I can very clearly remember when I first became interested in the way people appeared. And I don't think it's necessarily just clothes, or I do love antique and vintage garments. I love the textures. I love the stories they tell. I love
Mm.
the colors, the sensation of it. It's an incredibly sensual and interesting experience to dive into boxes that are, full of tissue paper, and you open the tissue paper, and here are these amazing, extraordinary textiles. But I think for me, maybe rather like a journalist, any kind of writer, I'm curious. And for me, looking at images, I used to get library books out. I lived in libraries, looking at images of what people wore in the past. I wanted to know, well, what were the people like?
Hmm.
What sort of person did you have to be to wear these incredible as a child? And so always, I go beyond the clothes, and it's a way of connecting with people. It's a way of saying, well, what would life be like for me back then? What was life like for those people? So it's a curiosity as well as that real appreciation for textiles and the people who make them and wear them.
And so this did start when you were a child.
Yeah, I mean, I
Wow.
was interested in a lot of things. I'm one of those people who will dive into a subject, whether it's ancient Rome or Egyptian culture or science fiction, anything. But I have very distinct memories of checking one book in particular out of our public library called Costume Cavalcade, which just had page after page after page
Wow.
of people wearing, these extraordinary clothes. And on one page, actually, there was one outfit that stuck in my mind. And years later, as an adult, I saw an outfit so similar from the 1870s, so the 19th century, and it's a purple silk walking dress. And I thought, oh, that's that dress that I first saw when I was 8 years old. And I bought it. I bought it just as a way of connecting with my childhood, which was, I would say it's a lonely childhood in terms of interacting with people, but never lonely because of interacting with books.
Wow. Did I've got to ask, is there a film you've seen where you thought the costume design was very accurate to the time?
You say accurate. And this opens up a whole interesting world of discussions. And in costume, for costume lovers, I don't always mind about accuracy. There are some films I just, oh, that is spot on. You have absolutely nailed what we think those clothes would be like. But there are other TV shows, and Bridgerton comes to mind because it's so big at the moment, but they're not wanting to be accurate. They want to be flamboyant and tell stories and tell characters. But I think for me, I do like seeing some Jane Austen adaptations where they've really, really done a great job on the costumes. So there was a recent one for the film Emma, which had this
Yes.
amazing yellow
Yeah.
police. And actually, I know the museum who bought that police recently in an auction, and it was a friend of mine who was working for the museum and bidding on it. And they also bought Mr. Darcy's shirt.
Oh, wow.
because I was messaging her saying, oh well, I've bid on this thing but I can't afford to to buy that, and I said, somebody's just paid £25,000 for Darcy's shirt, I wonder who it could be, and I just got this little emoji back going, and it's just gone on display in this museum in the north of England just down the road from me. So yeah, I would say that
Wow.
Elise is one that I would love to take home in my handbag.
When you mean Mr. Darcy, what Pride and Prejudice film was that from? Because there's been
That
so
was
many.
the 1996. The
Okay, like the
BBC
six
did a
hour
TV
one?
adaptation. Famously, Colin Firth dives into a
Yeah.
lake, and I was never bothered about Colin Firth so much, but I really love the wigs in that, and there's some lovely notes.
Wow.
It's a great show. There's so many
Now,
actually, and I like a lot of fantasy films where they draw on historical influences to create fantastical garments as well. I just watched the new Mad Max film, Furiosa, and Jenny Bevan did the costumes for that. She is a genius anyway, and just looking at it gives an added appreciation, doesn't it, when you bring your own niche interest to something and you
yeah.
just see some of those skills, the skills that have gone into making a finished extravaganza, visual extravaganza.
But is there anything like a film in particular that really you had a lot of angst about because the costumes just did not resonate at all with the time or
I haven't had time to think about that particular, but one thing that bugs me is because one of my favorite eras, apart from the Regency era, is the 1940s, is when people recreate the 40s to look as if all the women were very young and very stylish and had perfect makeup and perfect hair. And I'm thinking, oh, come on, there's a war on, you know. And also
yeah.
I love to see a lot of diversity in films, body shapes, ages, backgrounds, all of that. And so sometimes I do get a little bit narked with recreations of World War II, yeah, when people are just too stylish. And I like seeing clothes that look as if they're worn, as if somebody genuinely has gone out for a 12-hour shift and come home and they don't have enough soap because it's rationed, and their hair's a bit ratty because it was a windy day, or they've just had a
Yeah.
lush kiss with somebody and their lipstick's come off. So I quite like that realism.
Did you ever want to be like a costume designer on a film?
No, no, I'm not a behind the scenes gal. I like to present and talk about clothes and have the freedom of being a freelancer. I really, really like having my own, setting my own work and creating my own projects. And I just, what, I don't think I have the skills. I don't have the making skills to appreciate how an image can be turned into a garment. I do collaborate with costume makers. So when I'm putting on a presentation about clothes, I work with really talented milliners and tailors and so on, and they create replica garments. And I love that
Hmm.
process, but it's beyond my skill set. Not my forte.
Well, you know, I can tell by the way you speak. It makes sense that you're an author because you're using all these words and it's almost as if um, you, what's the word I'm looking for? You come alive, you caress the words. It's like really exciting and lively when you speak, especially about the things you're passionate about, and you're able to put that and articulate that into words, which is such a gift. For, some of my listeners, I'm sure haven't read any of your books, but the recent one that you wrote about Auschwitz, can you tell me, about how did you find out about it? And how did you decide that you wanted to write a book on it? Um, and why do you think it's important for people to read and be interested
Wow, these
in?
are big questions. I mean, you obviously love words and you love communicating too. And that's what it comes down to, doesn't it? Storytelling, whether it's fact or fiction, is about making connections. It's about either sharing knowledge or sharing a worldview or just simply interacting as human beings. So
Yeah.
I write fiction and nonfiction. And I've always loved history since I've been a student. And squirreling away in the back of my mind things that caught my interest. And in particular, I suppose it's the ways in which women and girls, I focus very much on the lives of women and girls. Perhaps that's a very personal thing. The way they manage in extreme situations,
Hmm.
because so many stories about war, they're about men and this military heroism. But I always wanted to know, what's it like? What would it be like to be me in the middle of World War II, for example? So
Yeah.
I've always been swirling away this sense of, well, yes, that's all very well, but I'd never be driving a tank. I would more likely to be doing this. So I need to make this answer shorter because it's such an interesting topic. So I came across mention of a fashion salon in Auschwitz, and a lot of my work, my sort of perhaps more scholarly work, had been looking into the way people write about extreme experiences. They don't necessarily write Greek tragedies and great formal works, but people will write scraps of notes in a diary, or they'll write postcards. They'll
Yeah.
write these fragments. And so I'd been gathering fragments of Holocaust history, that sense of things that people just jotted down, or one last desperate message. And I came across reference to a fashion salon in Auschwitz, and this combined so many of my interests, obviously
Hmm.
sewing and creating
Yeah.
beautiful clothes. But then how can you have a fashion salon in Auschwitz? So I wanted to find out more and met many dead ends. And so that creative brain part of me thought, what would it be like to be, let's say, 14 years old, first day at work, and you become aware that your life depends on your sewing skills. And my grandmother, one of my grandmothers, Ella, was a professional dressmaker during the 1940s, luckily very safe in England. And she tried to teach me to sew with very limited success. But I thought, what would I do? If that, what would you do, Danielle? You would try and rise to the occasion. So I wrote a
Yeah.
book. I wrote a children's, well, a young adult novel called The Red Ribbon, which was very well received. And then this is where it got really interesting, because people in Israel read the book, read reviews of the book, and they
Hmm.
contacted me and said, well, you know what? That was my aunt. That was my mother. That was my
Wow.
grandmother. So from fiction, this extraordinary serendipity, these connections brought me to reality. And it became a great privilege and a real challenge to write the story of the real dressmakers, young Jewish women, mainly from Slovakia, who worked in a fashion salon established by the commandant's wife at Auschwitz. And some of
Hmm.
your listeners may have seen the recent Oscar-winning film Zone of Interest and have become aware of the lives of SS in the concentration camp universe, and the horrific hypocrisy and exploitation. But my story very much centers on a group of young women, as I learned who they were, their names, their faces. And I was able to interview the last surviving dressmaker of Auschwitz, an
Oh,
American woman.
wow. How
Yeah, yes,
fascinating.
you can imagine that experience. You love interviewing people. And so Bracha Kohut from California, I flew out to meet her and spent time with her and her family. And perhaps rather like you, I went armed with lots of questions because, a historian or a journalist or an interviewer, we just want to know so much. And she sat me down and she just said, you listen. I'm like, okay. So I spent a lot of time listening to what she was saying and listening to what she wasn't saying. And out of this, crafted a nonfiction book, which, I was so pleased to have done, and to have told a narrative history, a true history, but in a way that's very readable. And I thought, maybe some people will be interested. Well, it turns out a lot of people were. It was on the New York Times bestseller list for 6 months, which was a very staggering experience, actually, to realize that so many people had picked up this book and engaged with
Hmm.
it. And
Yeah.
it's since been translated into 22 languages, and it's recently come out. There's a Hebrew edition. So many different languages and so many different people contacting me about it. So believe it or not, that was the short answer for how I came to write it. And yes, very, very important to, as you do, to lift people's voices, to give people a voice, and all these stories deserve an audience.
So you actually found out about the dressmakers through these people who actually reached out to you from another fiction book because they
Yeah.
That's crazy.
It's
Wow.
beautiful, isn't it? It's almost a
Yeah.
kind of magic. And I think some of it, as any one creative, it's about following your integrity. I knew I wanted to write a story. I couldn't find the true story as it happened, but I wrote it with as much integrity and knowledge as I could. It was fictionalized. There were fictional people. And then to have the honor of telling the truth alongside that, both of very, valid ways of engaging with history. But that for me personally was an extraordinary experience, and I think it still resonates now.
Were you able to show the book to the lady you interviewed, or did she pass away?
Do you know she did? She died of COVID, sadly, one Valentine's Day. But she knew all about it, and she knew that it was going to be a big deal. And I think what was really special as well, it centered her story out of so many stories in her family. Every family has a cascade of stories. It
Yeah.
centered her. And I think she was in her 90s. Her family, obviously, they loved her and they appreciated her. But when they built her memorial on her grave, they actually inscribed it with the words, "The last dressmaker," because that had come to be part of her identity. She was the last dressmaker of this fashion salon in Auschwitz. So I feel very honored to have shared her voice and to give her companions in the fashion salon a voice too.
Yeah.
And just for a moment, as strangers, we connected. It's very special.
Did is there a book you've written, either fiction or not, that has personally impacted your life and changed it in some way?
I think everything we create changes us in ways that we perhaps don't appreciate until we look back. Each project we engage with changes us, and I've loved all of the books I've written, but this book in particular, The Dressmakers of Auschwitz, it most certainly has changed me. Um, in the I suppose it's part of your career. Now as a mature writer, I'm in my 50s. It's really wonderful. I feel really lucky to have reached a point where I'm writing what I believe in. I'm doing what
Mm.
I believe in. I've worked really hard all my life to find scope for what I want to do. But I also think that personal sense of, I mean, can you call it giving back? I feel like I'm doing something that really matters. And the new book I have coming out in January next year, it's another Holocaust history, and I've lifted the story of four girls, all
Mm.
connected through a garment. It is still, clothes history. And again, it's that sense of, I'll do what I can with my talents to create a sense of community and to shed a light on what brings us together and what pulls us apart.
Do you feel like now in the age we're living in, this is, very a message that people really need to hear in some way, that you feel like if I'm writing these books, I'm able to tell people that through history? Because in a lot of ways, I mean, it seems like history, repeats, wars repeat, things repeat, the same power struggles, the same emotions, they all happen, the same weaknesses and mistakes, and it all drives to the same thing again. Um, and so for you, it's interesting because you seem to have such a love for the past and history, and yet in some ways you're encouraging people through what you're writing. Can we not go back to these times when people had to struggle so much?
But
And
it
there
doesn't
was
change. It never changes. Humans don't change. We look back at the past, and the writer LP Hartley very famously said the past is a foreign country. And you think, okay, but it's only foreign to us. It's not foreign to the people living in it. It's present tense, and we are living in present tense that is going to become history. And I don't see history as past and done with. I just see it as another generation of humans trying to
yeah.
make sense of their world, messing up their world, and out of all of the chaos and the horror and the cruelty, there are always stories of people trying to build communities and trying to nurture friendships and trying to, blow gently on love so it grows. So yes, it can be incredibly dispiriting that you think I'm writing about history. I I wrote The Dressmakers of Auschwitz during the first months of the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, and we're thinking, oh my goodness, I'm seeing in real time in my communities how people can either come together or fracture. And I think all of us, whatever our political or racial or cultural, religious backgrounds, we see how we can other people or we can humanize them. And that's just a given, isn't
Yeah.
it? So, yes, I'm writing about the past. Yes, I'm writing about a particular aspect of history, a particular era, but it's not really. I'm writing about us. I'm writing
Hmm.
about us as perpetrators or victims or bystanders or friends or, whatever it might be. We can see ourselves in history if we look.
Do you, um, why do you think the clothes element? Because, your books do revolve a lot around clothing. What do you find so unique about clothing that adds to the story for your characters so that people can? Because it's interesting, it's the clothing in some ways that is different for each era, whereas your audience is going to connect with the people, but their clothes is the thing about them that's different. One of the things that's different about them. But what do you find in the clothing so unique that you do think that that kind of brings the book together in a special way?
I would say, okay, there's a difference between, yes, fashions change, but the fundamentals of clothes are the same for all of us. We wear clothes, early humans wear them for decoration and for protection. And that stays with us, doesn't it? We wear things that we think, oh, I love that color, I love that texture, or I love the flamboyance, or whatever. So there's decoration. Then there's protection. Of course, humans can explore any habitat if they have the right clothing for it. So that's
Mm.
a constant in human history. Then we get really interesting, and everyone signals things about their clothes, whether it's to do with their gender, their status, it could be religion, it could be political. We're always sending messages with our clothes, and that's the same. It might be that in one era a woman is wearing a long gown with a bustle, and that signifies something, in that era. Or now we're wearing I don't know, some trainers with a particular sneakers, with a particular logo, and that signifies something to us. And then it gets interesting because you start going into technology. What are our clothes made from? What are the resources? Who's
Mm.
making them? And that is the same in every era. Those questions about labor and about natural resources or synthetics and so on. And so it isn't so much the silhouette or the color or the imagery of clothing. And so if we go back to, for example, the dressmakers of Auschwitz, so much of it, yes, it revolves around clothes because the very reasons that a fashion salon was established in Auschwitz are some of the crucial reasons for why the SS, why the Nazi Third Reich, why it expanded and was short-term very successful. And you can see the motivations of
Mm.
people based on greed and vanity. And all of that is shown in the textile industry of the time and the way that the Nazis
Wow.
operated. So, clearly I could talk about this for a very long time. I wrote a very long book about it. So clothes are a really interesting perspective and a really interesting way into any topic. And I've lectured on all sorts of topics, linking it with clothes. And this might be something to do with class, or it might be something to do, it might be gender, or it might be politics or art history. And it's such a fresh way of looking at things. And you go, yes, I hadn't thought about it like that. But when you do stop and think about it, you're like, so I'm going to give you an example. I just give a talk on 19th century clothing, and we have this idea that, oh my goodness, weren't women ridiculous in their fashions? They're wearing these long skirts and these hoops and all of this. And I used an example of a woman in 1871 whose long skirts were dragged into a carriage wheel and she was pulled under the carriage, a terrible traffic accident, and she was in a grievous state in hospital. And we instantly think, well, she's just ridiculous. Her clothing got caught. What were they thinking?
That's
And
a
yet
real
in March,
story?
oh yeah, yeah. I mean, it happened.
Oh,
There were frequently accident incidents with clothing,
oh my
catching fire or
goodness.
whatever. We too many petticoats. So you think, well, that's ridiculous. I'm not like that. We're modern people. But in March this year, 2024, there was a story of a woman in the UK. she'd just gone out shopping, and she was standing next to a store that had one of those roller shutters that rolls down,
Yeah.
rolls up to protect it. And her coat got caught in the shutter as it was opening, and she was dragged up with the shutter. And it's actually, I'm pleased to say, she was fine. It was actually quite hilarious, this, because it was all videoed from I don't know, a security camera. And she's been pulled up this shop shutter, and everybody on social media is sort of laughing, and she's going, I'm fine afterwards. And you realize it's the same thing. It's just humans, isn't it? Being humans. Yes, she was wearing a puffer coat, a big coat. This Victorian woman was wearing a long frock with, flounces on her petticoats. But these clothes don't make us different. They're just different languages that we can interpret it to understand more about our own culture.
Mm. And is your goal with all of this, your heart behind it, is it trying to bring people together to see how similar people are as opposed to how different they are?
I suppose I wasn't consciously driven by that, in as much as you feel the urge to tell a story, to tell the truth. But I'm coming to understand more and more the more work I do, in one case it with Holocaust history, but in all of the public presentations I do, it is about celebrating what makes us human, and celebrating generational memories. Yes, it all comes down to connections and people. I'm really
Mm.
starting to understand that a lot more now in this part of my career.
What?
And sorry, no, go ahead.
No. I was gonna say because you have come so far, you've been in the writing industry, you've been doing this a long time. What was the hardest thing starting out? Was there a time when you were so discouraged, you were like, I don't want to keep going with the writing, that you pushed through somehow? Did you ever get to like just some sort of bump where you did not want to keep going and it was just
I think
such a
there are always
discouraging time?
bumps. There are always, but there's never a time when you're coasting and you've got it all right. I don't
Mm.
think there's never been a time when I haven't written. It's a compulsion, fiction, nonfiction. We all have challenges along the way. You're starting out in a career, you might be full of enthusiasm, and you don't realize quite what the real world of publishing is about. I think even as a successful writer, each new pitch, you're still thinking, oh, is anybody going to be interested in this? And each success is still a surprise and a relief. So I would say you never get to a point where there are no bumps. And of course, as we all know, life happens and throws things at you, and this can be illness, bereavement, and just those ordinary human things, like I feel rubbish today, or I don't feel confident today. What's the point? So I think it's okay to roll with that, and to say, yep, this is a bump. This is a bump, but I'll get through it. We always get through it. We adapt. And one thing that kept me going while writing The Dressmakers of Auschwitz, because, I'd never written a book quite like it before. And I was thinking, well, am I doing it justice? Am I doing a good enough job?
Hmm.
And I thought of Bracha, the last surviving dressmaker who I went to interview, and I thought of her telling a friend in Auschwitz. Her friend Irene was despairing, with good reason. Irene was saying, we can't get out of here. There's no way out. We're going to die here. And Braca said, no, we are getting out. We are getting out of here, and we are going to go home and have coffee and cake again. And I just thought of Braca's resilience and her determination. And yes, she had a lot of luck. You can be as determined as you want, and we still all face bad luck, don't we? But every time I brewed a cup of tea, I'm English, I have to drink tea by the bucket load, or I got a slice of cake. I thought, so lucky, it was so lucky. And
Hmm.
it helped me keep going a lot. So resilience is wonderful. And there's a lot to be said for coffee and cake too, to keep going.
Tea, and I agree with you. It's one of the sweetnesses of life, those
Mm.
warm moments. Um, did you, but what bump in your life has been the hardest to get through?
Oh, so many bumps. Some of them are like giant, crumpled up tectonic plates.
I know,
Um,
I can understand. I
You know,
understand.
I would, uh, without being too personal, health. I got whacked 8 years ago with a really problematic health issue that is incurable and untreatable. And,
Mm.
I'm not saying I felt immortal before that, but wow, the adaptation that comes with that. And I think also sometimes mental health, we all have things that we carry with us that are really heavy and really weighty. And just learning to set some of them down or learning to get help carrying them is hard. But yeah, I have had setbacks, and there've been times, let's say in a creative professional sense, I thought, this is a great idea. Why is nobody going for this idea? And the real world of publishing is not every book gets published and not every book is a success. And maybe it's okay to fail too.
With what you were talking about with the illness you have, how does it affect your life? Is it something that affects it to a big degree or
Massive. It's massive. I
massive?
can I can
Okay.
only work limited hours. I have very, very limited working hours now. I work very part-time. My brain is going a million light years an hour, and my body just said, "No, you can't do that." So everything becomes very precious and everything becomes distilled into a couple of hours of work a day.
Wow. Okay.
But it teaches you what you have in terms of resources and the joys you have and what matters. And I do not mess around with idiotic emails, and the things that don't need doing. I have sloughed those off, and I feel very lucky. In a sense, I can say, what am I going to do with my resources, whether it's energy or time or money. What joy can I get from these, or what progression, or what can I do for someone else? So yeah, it's really hard.
So you don't do you find that it's helpful to be busy and not think about it as much?
It's impossible. I think when you have a disability that impacts your life, as any of your listeners will, you may know, we all carry something. It's really hard not to think about it. And perhaps that's the difference. But perhaps that's the issue. We think, oh, wouldn't it be great if life was like this? Anybody could think that way. You have an image of what you would like your life to be like. But
Yeah.
the reality is different. It might be better, it might be worse. It's all jumbled up. And perhaps that brings us back to Bracha, in Auschwitz, which is synonymous with horror and suffering and degradation, and that she was still able to conceive that life can be better and that there will be coffee and cake. And even when I was telling the stories of the dressmakers, even within the fashion salon where they worked, in this appalling mental and physical trauma, they found joy. They deliberately crafted things that gave their life meaning.
Yeah.
And yes, they had the diversion of work, creating fashions for the SS. But what mattered to them were the stories that they told, their memories of home, their
Mm.
friendship connections, all under
Yeah.
the eye of the guards. So yeah, we find meaning where we can.
Yeah. Where do you find meaning as a writer? And even now as because it's interesting in the writing, you're getting to immerse yourself in these worlds and you're getting to, in some ways, experience what it would be like to be other people. And at the same time, you're yourself with your own struggles and your own burdens that you bear. What gives you meaning in life as you're writing and as you're telling other people's stories? Like, do you ever wish the opportunity to maybe write about your own or,
Maybe we always are writing about our own lives in the stories that we choose to tell. But I see what you mean, like a specific biography. Interesting concept. I'm not ready to write about myself yet, although I do journal a lot. What gives me meaning? I think, just answering top of my head, I think visibility, that
mm,
we want to be seen as humans for who we are. And we want to be, perhaps, there comes a time in life when people want to be remembered. And so, working in Holocaust history, it's very much about memory, isn't it? People shouldn't just vanish and disappear and their names are gone. Very much about memorializing and passing on names and experiences to new generations. And perhaps for me, I like the idea of being seen, as a child who perhaps disappeared into the pages of books and wasn't very prominent or colorful or seen. It's nice to find my own voice. So I like doing the honors by giving other people voice, and maybe we're quite similar in that way. You're literally giving people voices, aren't you, with your podcast?
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting how many people don't actually talk about themselves. Like, there's things they do and they talk about their career and they're really flamboyant about whatever it is that they do. But then when it gets down to actually asking them, well, what do you, what
Mm.
is life like for you, or what are their hardships, these things. It's like when you get to know who people are, kind
I
of
think
they
people
come
tend to
out
have a
of there.
script about their lives, and sometimes
Yeah.
it's easier just to give elements of your script. And it
Yeah.
doesn't mean the script is a lie. It can be a
No.
brilliant script. It can be embellished. It can be total theatrics. But I think in a lot of society, and there is a dance that people do, this form, how are you? No, how are you? I've never understood that dance really. I've learnt it. But if somebody asks me, how are you? I will literally have to tell them how I am, whatever thing is happening in my life. And that reminds me of interviewing Bracha for the book, that she had been used to telling her life story in a certain way to her family, perhaps, amongst her close friends. And as an interviewer, I imagine, you have this skill set, don't you, of, well, how do I get someone to go off script? And not in a way that you're trying to trip them up or, catch them out or anything nasty like that, but more, how do I get to somebody and get them to talk? The issue with me is getting me to shut up, honestly. I love talking.
Well, as a kid, you mentioned that you were quiet, you like books, but you seem like you would be a good conversationalist as a kid. Was that something you just developed over
Okay, when I say I
time,
was
or is
quiet, it's more I was talkative, but no one was listening. If
oh,
you put it that way, they you can be blabbling along at a million miles an hour, and I was famous for that. But talking and having listeners is a very different thing. Both are valid. It's okay, and it's the same as writing a book. Not all books will find their readers, but the writing of it is also what counts. It took me a long time to find my tribe, and I think all of us want to find people where we feel listened to, where we feel heard, where we feel seen. And I love the way now that the internet can connect us in so many fabulous ways. I know
yeah.
it's also terribly destructive, and the trolling and so on, but we can find people who see us, who hear us, and hopefully do the same for them.
Is you it for you, is it your, readership and the fellow costume admirers that has kind of become like your family? This is like my fam. This is the interesting
They're
things that we can talk
brilliant.
about.
Yeah, the audiences, when I go and do talks, I mean, I've been doing this for nearly 25 years, giving talks about clothes, and I take the garments along and I wear them and I show them and I tell stories about them. True stories, they're all true. And, I've gotten to know so many people, some really, really close friends, really dear friends, and of all ages and generations. And that is a boon, I think, for people to mix with folk outside of their own peer group and outside of their own
Yeah.
age group. You get so many rich experiences. And then coming back to clothes, I get donated things for my collection. My collection has several thousand garments in it now, because people bring things
Wow.
along going, this was my mother's, this was my grandma's, this was mine. And some of them are wedding dresses, which you might expect people would give, but some of them are so intimate or so fun or just so random almost. And they say, well, this actually has a story that began in Iran, and then I just want to listen, and I take their object and I add it to the collection and tell the story of it. And the most remarkable garment in my collection is a garment made by one of the dressmakers in the Auschwitz fashion salon. And I just look at the stitches and think, oh my goodness, what have your fingers done? You know, what have they made? What did your eyes see?
Where did you
So
get that one? Was it from
it
the
was
lady you
donated
interviewed?
by a relative. It was
Oh,
donated by her
wow.
niece. And she, you see, that's it. She was looking for connection too. You know, I contacted her. I'm the historian. I'm writing a book about her aunt. And she wanted her story to be heard. This is the gift that you're giving people, aren't you? You're helping them tell their stories. And she shared her aunt's memoirs. She chatted with me. You know, I really like this woman. She's in Boston and in Massachusetts. I've not yet had the pleasure of meeting her in person, but you know, we're in touch. I feel like we are friends. You know, we care about each other because of this connection. And she didn't want this garment just to be, you know, lost or given to Goodwill, or, you know, it was precious to her. She saved it long
Oh,
after her
yeah.
died.
Wow.
So I feel like I'm a repository for people's memories and stories, you know, rather like what you're doing and gathering, you know, for podcasts and for blogs.
Yeah,
That's
and
a
gathering
really
it
special.
through clothing. It is, yeah, it's really
Yes.
special. It's
Yeah, you're
really
starting to
unique.
get it now. You began, didn't you, Danielle, with saying, "Well, I'm not really sure clothing. Why would you do that?" And now you get it.
Yeah.
Each one is a treasure, you know, and it's like a musical box, and you open it up, and it's got gilt glowing inside, and the little ballerina doll, and the music, and it's like, oh, what's going to be in this box? And that's what all these garments are to me. And despite illness, I'm so passionate about wanting to keep sharing these stories, which is why it is a pleasure to talk to you today. You know, that this is what I love doing.
Well, Lucy, just to, I want to respect your time. One last question. Could you tell me and my audience, I know you said that you tell people really, you'll dress up into a costume and you'll tell a story based on a costume. What is a really story, like what's a story you keep coming back to about one of your costumes that when you're doing these presentations, you say often?
Immediately, a rude one came into my mind. Do you want the rude one?
Sure.
I was doing a talk
Sure.
on 18th
Yeah.
century portraits. You know, imagine a gorgeous portrait with a, you know, the big elaborate scrolled gold frame and a woman inside it, you know, beautiful clothes, feathers in her hair, the hair all done, and silks and lace and everything. And so I was actually dressing up as if I was going to be in a portrait. Beautiful garments. These were replicas that I was wearing, and I was talking about the ways that we construct images of people. And I said, when you're looking at a portrait from the past, do you see a woman, or do you just see the imagery? Do you just see the clothes? Do you just see, you know? And I was saying, look, there's a famous portrait in Chicago in the art gallery there, and it's a woman who, you know, she's doing something sort of vaguely mythical, and her best friend at the time said, well, she never did that. She used to like playing cricket, and she ate beefsteak. You know, so immediately that humanized her as a rounded human being, not just an
Hmm.
image of idealized femininity. Anyway, so I did this talk, and you know, I thought, this is so knowledgeable, this is so interesting. And then afterwards, a very well dressed, very spoken English woman came up, and she said, my dear, I should like to know. And I thought, oh God, it's going to be in Latin or something, you know, it's going to be something really, really specific about 18th century art history. She said, my dear, I should like to know, how did they get ravished? I said, what? How did they get ravished? I said, well, I don't know. I've never tried it. And she said, I bet you have. So you know what I did? I went away and I tried it. And all we can say is, you go up and under. Humans don't change, they find ways. How
Wait.
did they get ravished? What was going on in her mind? What
Okay.
story?
And ravish, and I'm sorry, I guess forgive me because ravished meaning at first I thought like raped was what she meant.
No, I see what you mean. It can be a euphemism. I think she was just talking about, we would say nookie in English slang. No, she was just talking, how did they have sex? Because you know there are so many layers and the corsetry and the, you know,
And
the
you
petticoats
tried
and everything.
it?
Yeah. Well, I meant in that
Funny.
costume. She was meaning, I suppose, you know, there's all of these layerings, but people being people, you know, they're attracted to each other. We've all watched Bridgerton, we know it happens. And yeah, so she just wanted to know, how did you manage to have sexual congress? But she phrased it in that lovely, how did they get ravished? Yeah.
That's hilarious, and that you decided to try it with the dress to see.
Well,
That's
let's not
that's
dwell on
also
that.
hilarious.
Let's not dwell.
I think that's the funniest part. I'm sorry. All
That's
right, well,
okay because
listeners.
things can be joyful, can't they? They're joyful, they're tragic, they connect us. Um, yeah, I could tell you so many stories about the clothes in my collection, and some of them are they will break your heart, so bittersweet.
Mm,
In fact, I had an exhibition last year featuring my collection at the same museum that now owns Mr. Darcy's wet shirt from Pride and Prejudice. They hosted an exhibition all year, and one of the display cabinets was called Bittersweet. And it was about
wow.
garments that each represented a story that you think, oh my gosh, that breaks my heart. But we also recognize all the stories in it. There's stories of loss or hardship or so, and that they're us.
Hmm. Well, Lucy, I want to thank you so much. I mean, this has just been fascinating, and I've been listening, and I'm just like, man, I wish I could talk forever. But thank you so much for your time and for, telling the story, and also for listeners. I hope that they will take an interest in your book. I'm gonna have a link to your website, which has more information about Lucy,
Sure.
um, and her books and what she does. But thank you, Lucy, so much for your time. It's been great.
And thank you, Danielle, for what you do as well. You're going to have your own bumps, I'm sure, and your own joys. And I wish you so much luck and so many connections of your own.